Well, thank you, Brother Zane. We'll end the meeting now directly over to Brother Marius.
Good evening, everybody, again. It's good to be with you. Would you turn with me to the third epistle of John, John's third epistle. The third epistle of John. And we'll start reading verse 9. 3 John, verse 9. I wrote unto the church, but Theotrophies, who loveth to have the preeminence among them, receiveth us not. Wherefore, if I come, I will remember his deeds which he doeth, prating against us with malicious words, and not content therewith, neither doth he himself receive the brethren, and forbiddeth them that would, and casteth them out of the church. Beloved, follow not that which is evil, but that which is good. He that doeth good is of God, but he that doeth evil hath not seen God. And we know that the Lord will bless the word that we've read together. This is the third week in our study of 3 John. And I can scarcely believe that there's only 1 week left in our little series in this letter. But as we've discovered 2 weeks ago, this epistle is built around the characters of 3 men. They are Gaius, Theotrophies, and Demetrius. Last week, you'll remember that we've looked at the first 8 verses and we focused on the man who helped God's work, Gaius. He was a man marked by the truth, by love, by a lovely testimony, and a man marked by Christian hospitality. Unfortunately, there was another man mentioned in this letter who did not possess the spirit of a Gaius, and who made it difficult for him and others to show kindness and hospitality to others. And so tonight, we're going to look at the second character in this epistle, Theotrophies, a man who hindered God's work. Now you'll find that there's no doctrine laid out in 3 John. It is really a personal letter. He writes to his friend Gaius to encourage him in his stand against Theotrophies, the man who resisted John's leadership, his authority, and therefore his Lord. 3 John shows how division in the church arose even in the days of the Apostle John. And the root cause of this division, as also in our day, is that age-old problem of mankind. Pride, which is usually the basis or the outcome of a me-first mentality. If Gaius was marked by hospitality, this man was marked by pride. You remember in 2 John, problems arose from within in the form of false teachers. But in 3 John, we are introduced to problems that came from, or rather in 2 John, there were problems from without in the form of false teachers. But in 3 John, we are introduced to problems from within in the form of a domineering man, a domineering leader among God's people. He had so much power that he even rejected apostolic authority. What a sad, sad situation when carnality seeks to rule over spirituality, when the human replaces the divine, as this man Theotrophies wanted the first place. the place of preeminence, which rightfully belonged to Christ alone. While there are many today who have the spirit of a Gaius, and they are assets to the assembly, it is not uncommon to find those who have the spirit of Theotrophies, who tend to disrupt the unity and the love that should be present in every place. This letter, as we've looked at when we looked at the introduction and the overview, the letter divides into 3 sections. In verses 1 to 8, we have the exhortation of Gaius. He received the brethren. In verses 9 to 11, we have the exposure of Theotrophies. He rejected the brethren. In verse 12 to 14, we have the example or the endorsement of Demetrius. He revived the brethren. We've already covered the first section last week, the exhortation of Gaius in verses 1 to 8. For this session tonight, we'll focus on the second part of this epistle, verses 9 to 11, which deals with the exposure of Theotrophies. In order to guard against the spirit and an attitude of a Theotrophies, we shall look at the following as we expound this little epistle, or this little section of 3 verses. I want you to note in verse 9, the attitude of Theotrophies. And then in verse 10, the actions of Theotrophies. And in verse 10 to 11 again, the advice of John. Let's start with the first part in verse 9, the attitude of Theotrophies. What do we know about this man? Well, nothing is known about him other than what is here specified. That he was a man of influence is very clear. From what we can gather, he was proud, he was ambitious, and he was desirous for recognition. Without a doubt, he was a man of ability. Otherwise, he would not have had the following among the saints. However, the object of his service was not Christ. It was self. He loved to feel important. He loved to be important. Verse 9 says, he loveth to have the preeminence among them. You see, the problem in 3 John is not theology or doctrine, as in 1 John and 2 John, but it's rather personal ambition and pride. Theotrophies was not a false teacher, but he was guilty of taking a position in the assembly that belonged to Christ alone. He wanted to be first among the saints. He loved to have the preeminence among them. He was sadly taken up and occupied with his own importance. But John exposed him, this attitude, and John condemned this proud and carnal spirit of Theotrophies. The problem of pride explains the majority of church problems down through the ages. What was that? People wanted to be first. You remember last week discovered that Gaius loved the truth. But the only thing Theotrophies loved was himself. He wanted to be the boss, and he attempted to boss others around. Now, this attitude might be okay out there in the workplace, out there in the world, but when we bring it into the assembly, it creates friction among the flock. John writes, but Theotrophies, who loveth to have the preeminence among them, received us not. Here is something quite interesting. 3 John provides the only reference to the church in any of John's epistles. And it occurs 3 times. You'll find it in verse 6, You'll find it in verse 9, and then you find it again in verse 10. The first thing you notice in verse 9 is, I wrote unto the church. And the last thing that you find in verse 10, and casteth them out of the church. And that seems to be the context in which these three men are seen. Theotrophies appear to have been an influential person in the church, and in demonstrated that influence in refusing to receive John, his letter that he sent in verse 9. The idea is that he did not acknowledge John. He did not accept John's early letter. But it went beyond the refusal of a letter. It was also the rejection of John himself. It was the rejection of apostolic authority as well. So influential and dominant was Theotrophies that most in the church feared him. And John therefore had to write to an individual instead, to Gaius, to request hospitality for Demetrius, knowing that Demetrius will be rejected by Theotrophies, and he will be neglected by others who fear Theotrophies. And so John condemned this attitude. It demanded a rebuke, and John intends to visit this church personally to expose him in person for who he really was, the exposure of Theotrophies. Unfortunately, there are plenty of men like Theotrophies among the people of God today. And they're always characterized by this attitude. They want to be first. They want a part of that glory that belongs to Christ alone. They are all marked by a spirit of pride, by the sin of pride. The name Theotrophies means trained by Zeus, the god Zeus, of course. Zeus was considered the king of gods. And maybe that contributed to this man's pride if he lived up to the meaning of his name. His sin was not so much the place that he held or aspired to, but an attitude of heart. His desire to be first was simply a symptom of his underlying pride. Pride, the greatest of all sins, because the sin of pride is as old as time. It was the very reason why Satan was banished from heaven. He was the father of pride because he desired to be like the Most High God. You'd recall in Genesis chapter 3, Satan approached Eve in the garden and he brought to her the same temptation of pride when he said, "Ye shall be as gods." And Eve, inspired in a proud heart to be like the Most High, which was also the original sin of Satan's heart. That was Satan's way. And sadly today, it is a way followed by many, be they believers or unbelievers. However, this same John, the Apostle John, he wrote of another way. And he wrote of another John, John the Baptist. In his gospel, John chapter 1, he wrote of John the Baptist, his words and his attitudes in relation to Christ. John said, "I am the voice, but he is the word." In Matthew chapter 3, he says, "I baptize with water, but he baptizes with the Holy Ghost and with fire." John says in Luke chapter 3, "I came to prepare the way of the Lord," but he is the way. John chapter 1 again, John was a witness to the light, but he is the light of the world. Little wonder, John sums it all up by saying, he must increase, I must decrease. That's the way of Christ. Humility. This desire of Theotrophies to be first was originally found in Satan. And it is the exact opposite of what we find in our blessed Lord. Paul writes in the Philippians in chapter 2, and Paul says that he made himself of no reputation, that he took upon himself the form of a servant, that he became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. Satan's way is to exalt himself. He humbled himself. Satan's way is to rebel. He became obedient. Satan's way was to cast down. Satan was cast down rather as a result, but God hath highly exalted him. Theotrophies, perhaps unconsciously, was following the way of Satan. Whose way are you following? Satan or Christ? The spirit of pride, the way of Satan, it's something that is accepted and even rewarded all around us today. It is the me first way of thinking that has infiltrated almost every part of society. The sports world is full of it. The entertainment world is full of it. The business world is full of it. It's the spirit of entitlement that says, it's all about me. I've earned it. It is sometimes sold to us as something so right, so logical, in the form of, if you don't look after number one, who will? This Theotrophies-like attitude is so prevalent today that we adopt it without giving it any second thoughts. My brother and sister, if you're not careful, this world will mold you into its thinking. And if we buy into this world's thinking and to this kind of thinking, it will affect our attitude in the assembly. You will feel after a while that the assembly that you are part of is just not with it. Maybe nobody recognizes you as the important person that you are, the smart and the talented person that you are. These seems to be the thoughts associated with the world. But it is possible that they exist in any one of us, because we are all part of the me generation, where the spirit of Theotrophies reigns supreme. It should not surprise us when the church is so influenced by the world to hear people say, but what about what I want? But what about what I think? There's really no room in the assembly for the me first mentality. Because if allowed, more sins and more problems are bound to follow, as seen in this man's life. Because the sin of pride is never absent from our hearts. But if we allowed it to rule over us, the effects in the assembly will be devastating. We see it in Theotrophies, who love to have the preeminence among his brethren. And many others, both in the past and in the present, have done that and had that attitude. Is it seen in us? How easy it is to allow a Theotrophies type of spirit to come into the assembly. You see, but pride is even more subtle. As we can be proud of things that are clearly a gift from God. Remember King Uzziah in 2 Chronicles chapter 26. He's one of those kings of whom it was written, He did which was right in the eyes of the Lord. And as a result, God blessed him and God prospered him. But when he became great and strong, his heart was lifted up. He became proud. What made this sin such an ugly one? Because pride takes us right back to the very sin of Satan, whose heart was lifted up because of the very things that God has given him. Ezekiel tells us that his heart was lifted up because of his beauty, because of his wisdom, because of his brightness. Pride in the believer is simply a repetition of that original sin. And both James and John in the epistles, they tell us God's attitude towards pride. Both of them say, God resisteth the proud. We've noticed already that this man was not a false teacher. He didn't subscribe to some false doctrine. His problem was an attitude of heart. He sought to exalt himself. Pride, however, never stops with the exaltation of self. In order to be first, in order to be better than others, one must reject anyone else that is perceived to be a threat to self. Anyone else who would stand in my way. And that becomes very clear in the second part of verse 9. We read that verse 9 again. I wrote unto the church, but Theotrophies, who loveth to have the preeminence among them, received us not. This can also be translated as, he did not accept us. He did not acknowledge us. John was the last living apostle, a representative of Christ himself. So why on earth would an ordinary man like Theotrophies reject one of the Lord's apostles? I tell you why. It was because John was a threat to his monopoly of power in the local assembly. John says that he's already written to this church before. That's how verse 9 starts. I wrote unto the church. But Theotrophies, who seemed to have been in charge, he didn't accept and acknowledge John or his letter or his authority. Perhaps this is why John, the second time, he didn't write to the church, but he wrote to an individual, Gaius, because that's the only way he could make sure that the letter would eventually get to the church. This perhaps implies that Theotrophies destroyed the letter written in the first place. It beggars belief that Theotrophies would refuse to accept and submit to the disciple whom Jesus loved, an apostle of our Lord Jesus Christ, a man who personally walked with the Lord. But because of his love to be first, there was no room in his heart for someone else, let alone someone over him, someone in authority. And that was his problem. Pride Pride does not suffer authority over it. Pride doesn't submit to others. It dents the ego of the proud. However, the Bible teaches us a chain of authority in the kingdom of God. As creator, God has all authority. If you go to Matthew chapter 28, the Lord says, all power is given unto me in heaven and in earth. That authority that is held in heaven had been delegated to the Son. All power is given unto me. Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 1 and he says, God hath put all things under his feet, and he gave him to be head over all and over all things to the church. So God delegated authority to Christ. But when you come to John chapter 13, the Son in turn has delegated authority to his apostles. There we read that the Lord said to his disciples, "He that receiveth whosoever I send, whosoever I send, received me. And he that received me, received him that sent me." Their authority, however, was not in themselves. They spoke through the Spirit who assisted them, who guided them into all the truth, so that they would speak and write with the authority of God behind them. I want to take you to 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. And we'll read verse 13. "For this cause also, thank we God without ceasing, because when ye received the word of God, which ye heard of us, ye received it not as the word of men, but as it is in truth, the word of God." This is why we find that the early church continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, because they spoke for God. They spoke with the very authority of God. Now we know from other letters that the apostles had a unique role in the history of the church. They were to lay the foundations of the church, and they were given the authority to settle questions within the church. It is that apostolic word that is passed on along to us in the New Testament. And that is why the New Testament is so important and authoritative to Christians. It is evident that the Theotrophies had problems, not only accepting John, but accepting this apostolic authority that John carried. But this attitude is not uncommon in our day either. The equivalent of rejecting apostolic authority is to reject the apostles' doctrine that we have in our New Testament. Many today are rejecting the apostles' authority of the New Testament in favor of modernism, in favor of the wisdom of men. That is the same as rejecting apostolic authority. Are we perhaps guilty in doing that? Or may the Lord help us to pattern our lives after such men as Gaius, who was in the truth, who loved the truth, and who received the brethren. Men like Demetrius at the end of this epistle, who would revive the brethren. And may the Lord deliver us from the spirit of Theotrophies, whose self-seeking attitude was a result of sinful pride in his quest to be number one. The attitude of Theotrophies. As noticed earlier, if his attitude was that of pride, that attitude almost always affects our actions. And that's exactly what we see in verse 10. The actions of Theotrophies. This is the first example in the New Testament of someone who tried to run a local assembly. This situation was pretty serious because John previously wrote a letter to the church. But that letter, as well as John and his companions, they were rejected. So serious was this situation that John anticipated to pay this church a visit personally to deal with this man's actions. We read in verse 10, "Wherefore, if I come, I will remember his deeds, his actions, which he doeth." That word "wherefore" refers to the preceding statement by John. And it gives us the reason why he will expose Theotrophies evil deeds. It was because Theotrophies did not recognize the authority of the apostle. And so John will expose his behavior for what it is when it comes to visit. So what were the things that he was doing? What actions were born from such an attitude of pride? John indicates that this man was guilty of a number of wrong actions. And we'll find here the actions of Theotrophies in verse 10. In this section, his actions are described and John exposes them as evil. Evil. He says in verse 11, "Beloved, follow not that which is evil." These were the very issues that prompted the writing of this letter. Let's go through some of his actions. There was, first of all, a failure to recognize John's authority, John's instructions, John's commendations as binding. He says in verse 9, "He received us not." Although it is sad to see that the last living apostle was not recognized and not respected by all in his lifetime, his Lord was also rejected by his very own. And brother and sister, we can expect the same. But secondly, he not only disregarded the authority of the Apostle John, he also spake against him. He said slanderous things, evil things against the apostle. We carry on in verse 10. "I will remember his deeds which he doeth, prating against us with malicious words." He was gossiping maliciously about them as he spoke evil of his brethren. It was slander. This is the only occurrence of the word prating in the New Testament. And it means to babble incoherently, to talk nonsense, to gossip. It has the idea of bringing something false and empty against someone. It comes from the root that is used of the action of boiling water. You've seen what happens when a pot of water boils over. It causes a lot of bubbles, a lot of nothing. That's exactly the word being used here. Since prating is empty and useless, it describes empty people who engage in empty talk. That was the nature of Theotrophies' slander, emptiness. However, being empty nothingness, it still had an effect. It can still be hurtful to others. The word malicious itself means evil and hurtful. This man gave little concern about how he spoke about others. We are commanded in James chapter 4 not to speak evil one of another. For to do so, we're setting ourselves up as judges. I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about and what John is talking about. As there are many on the call tonight who had been the target of malicious words. Not only are they evil, they are hurtful. But how do we respond when it happens to me, when it happens to you? My first answer would be silence. Silence and well-doing are usually the best answer to slander. But sometimes it must be dealt with. And in this case, the approach should be like John, as we'll see in a minute. It should be to the point, it should be done in a way that could help and not hinder the cause of Christ. In fact, John did not care about the slander and his rejection. But when it started to affect others, the brethren, he responded in a firm manner. We don't have the time, but Paul has done the same thing in Acts chapter 16. Here, John indicates why he got involved in dealing with Theotrophies. Verse 10. We'll read the whole verse again. Wherefore, if I come, I will remember his deeds which he doeth, prating against us with malicious words. And this is the expression, and not content therewith. Slandering John was not enough for this man. He was not content with that alone. He went a step further. What did he do? And not content therewith, neither doth he himself receive the brethren. He intended to oppose and reject anyone associated with the Apostle John. You see, the word devil also means slanderer. So it is a serious sin when we slander someone else. And the only thing it accomplished is to leave one spiritually weak. You remember Gaius in verse 2. Gaius was spiritually strong. But slander in my life and yours will lead to a poverty of a soul rather than the prosperity of a soul. This man attempted to weaken the reputation of John and his associates, as he saw them as rivals who needed to be put down, who needed to be pulled down. It was really a matter of poor Theotrophies. Although he thought of himself as enriched and strong and powerful and influential, his behavior left him spiritually weak. How do we fare in this respect? Do we often engage in malicious gossip? You will find that it is often the desire for preeminence that leads to it. And in this case, not only to reject the apostolic teachings, but also to engage in evil speaking and gossiping. These are serious matters indeed. So the question is, why did Theotrophies slander John? Well, the question is, why do we engage in slander, in gossip? It makes me feel better about myself. It gives me a place above others. It gives me first place. That's why I did it. It is pride that leads me to pull others' reputations down because it makes me look better. It makes me look taller. But it's a sin. And here's a very important but difficult lesson. If you want better elders in your assembly, if you want better fellow Christians in your assembly, pray for them. Don't pull them down through slander. Lift them up through prayer. Theotrophies slandered the apostle because he wanted the preeminence. He not only refused to receive John, but he also refused to receive John's associates. But that's not all of his actions. He also refused to show hospitality to these traveling preachers. Verse 10 says, neither doth he receive the brethren. These are men, missionaries, who went from place to place preaching the word. You see, this went deeper than his dislike for John. He barred these travelers, these traveling teachers, from the church because he thought he was in charge. And he didn't cope well with the fact that the believers will be learning from others. So he did this to look good, to strengthen his own status and his own perceived authority. But then that's not enough. He also interfered with those who tried to offer hospitality and to stop those who wanted to receive these teachers. Still verse 10, towards the end. Neither doth he receive the brethren, and forbiddeth them that would. This man obviously tried to control everything and everyone in the assembly. He was doing what Peter warned the elders not to do, lording it over the flock. Inflated with pride and self-importance, he had the idea that God's flock was his flock. And rather than loving the flock, this man only loved himself. He loved to have the preeminence. That's not the end of his actions. The last expression in verse 10 says, he was also guilty of unspiritual and unscriptural actions by putting some out of the church who opposed him and who received these teachers, and casteth them out of the church. He was abusing church discipline by putting out of the church anyone who would go against him or who would stand up to him. And he was using discipline as a weapon to manipulate others to do what he wanted. John exposes him for taking these wrong actions. The Lord himself taught us the importance and the necessity of assembly church discipline in Matthew chapter 18. Paul also gives us very clear instructions for carrying it out in 1 Corinthians 5 and 2 Thessalonians 3. But it was never designed to get rid of people or to get my way. It is always applied for the purpose of bringing the guilty party to repentance, to having such a one restored. Theotrophies was a domineering Christian leader, exposed by John. Compared to that of Gaius, what a terrible testimony he had. He lacked the truth. He lacked love. He lacked a good witness. And to crown it all, he failed to show hospitality to the right people. His bitterness and his pride were hindrances to the work of the gospel. And his only real concern was for himself. He was really an instrument of Satan to destroy the work of God. As we examine ourselves, our attitudes, our actions, are we being used by God or by Satan? How was Guy supposed to deal with this man? What was he to do with such an individual in the assembly? Oh, he received good advice from the Apostle John in verse 10 to 11. And we will lastly look at the advice of John. First, there was something that John will do, and then there's something that Gaius needed to do. John says, this is what I will do in verse 10. Wherefore, if I come, I will remember his deeds which he doeth. This is what you need to do, Gaius, verse 11. Beloved, follow not that which is evil, but that which is good. We've already seen in Theotrophies' attitude. We've already seen his attitude. So what was John's approach? You'd think that John's first response would be to put Theotrophies out of the church, given the fact that he was guilty of excommunicating people on wrong grounds. John, however, doesn't threaten him with it in this letter. He never even mentions it. He only says that he will come and call to attention what Theotrophies was doing. I will remember his deeds. Literally, I will let him know, or I will let it be known to the assembly what he's been up to. He will expose Theotrophies for who he really was. He will expose him for his actions and what they really were. John's approach was firm, but without the nastiness or the cruelty or the evil that Theotrophies was known for. John had no intention to get rid of this man, this problem man. He would rather do everything possible to win him over. That, of course, doesn't mean that you'd sweep the issues under the table, under the carpet, but rather that he will confront and expose him for both his and the assembly's benefit. John's approach was Christ-like in leadership. The Lord, in his dealings with problem people, he never avoided the issues. He never avoided the people, but he approached it in a firm and a fair and in a godly manner. Are we Christ-like in our approach, even when it comes to those who have offended us? And so John gave advice to Gaius. He says in verse 11, "Beloved, follow not that which is evil, but that which is good." Notice that he doesn't advise Gaius to organize a split away from the church. Rather, he says, follow not that which is evil, but that which is good. This is clearly a reference to Theotrophies' evil behavior. In other words, do not follow these kinds of men who always want the preeminence, who continue to engage in evil actions, but do what is right. These men are following their own way, Satan's way, not God's way. They are not the men to follow. And then he continues, he says, "He that doeth good is of God, but he that doeth evil hath not seen God." This statement is not uncommon to John's writings as an indication of genuine faith, especially in 1 John. By implication, the genuineness of Theotrophies' faith is called into question here, because he has obviously done what was evil. And John uses this expression, "He hath not seen God," and it's usually equivalent to "is not a genuine Christian." He's not saying that he's not a Christian, but he is calling it into question, his faith. John indirectly advised Gaius not to imitate, not to follow Theotrophies, whose attitude, whose actions and speech, his words, aligned him with evil. This final piece of advice in verse 11 is to imitate that and those who are good. Imitation is a part of natural life, isn't it? Part of education. Young artists are encouraged by their teachers to imitate the great masters before they establish their own styles. And the same applies to musical composers. My brother and sister, we do well to follow and imitate those we respect and esteem highly. But the important thing that John is saying here is, make sure that you choose and follow and imitate the right people. Choose an example like Gaius, and choose an example like Demetrius, and avoid like the plague somebody like Theotrophies. I'm sure Theotrophies wasn't looking forward to meeting John. But brother and sister, the time is coming very soon when we're going to meet our Lord. And we're going to give an account, not to an apostle, but to the Lord of the churches. The attitude of Theotrophies, the actions of Theotrophies. And shall we pay attention to the advice that John has given to Gaius? As we close, the assembly where Theotrophies was in fellowship was in a sad state because of his carnal attitude, pride. Another contributor to the sad state was his behavior, his actions, because of his pride. Again, it is noteworthy, I've mentioned it already, that John did not Gaius to get together with Demetrius and other good and godly brethren to start another assembly. but rather to be a help in his local assembly and be faithful to his Lord. The spirit of Theotrophies, which expressed itself in a carnal attitude, that was also accompanied by the works of the flesh, actions, evil actions. This is not unique to leadership. It can always also be in our hearts. It comes naturally to us. It's easy to identify with Theotrophies, as we have a struggle with our tongues at times, slander, gossip. It's easy to identify with him as we struggle to get along with others from time to time. My brother and sister, as we close, may John's description of Theotrophies serve as a warning for us, and that Gaius might serve as an example of godliness, one to imitate and one to follow. May the Lord bless his word. Amen.
Now, thank you, Brother Marius, for sharing God's word with us, opening up the scriptures. Now, we're going to ask Brother Stuart from Hastings just to close the meeting in a word of prayer, asking the Lord's blessing upon us. Thank you, Brother Stuart.
Let us pray. Our gracious God, we thank thee for the ministry of thy word to each of us this evening. We thank thee for the reminder of the need for us to look upon others as better than self, to humble ourselves, not to be built up with vain glory or pride, and that we should at all times be welcoming of our brothers and sisters, receiving them as Christ has received us to the glory of God. We thank thee for the labors of Marius in the preparation of this series, for that which he has been able to draw out of this third epistle of John, for our blessing, for our instruction, and may it be as a result of the study tonight that we have exercise of heart to review our own lives, our part in our local assembly, our behavior one to another. We're reminded how good and pleasant it is when brethren dwell together in unity. We pray that, Father, for each assembly represented in this Zoom meeting tonight. Father, also we rejoice and acknowledge thy goodness in the life of Marian Caldwell, who is celebrating her 88th birthday today. We ask thy blessing upon her, as thou hast blessed her through her many years of service for thee in the land of Japan. We rejoice with her and give thee thanks for such a lifetime in fellowship with thyself. We thank thee for the Takapuna Assembly, who sponsor or organize this Zoom meeting each week to the benefit of many other assemblies and people. We ask thy blessing upon this ministry with thanksgiving, committing one another to thee this night with thanksgiving through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.